Hello, scholars! Welcome back to U.S. history class. Hope you're doing okay. Hope you're getting some sunshine, washing your hands, learning lots from e-learning. So we're going to jump in today to continue talking about civil rights movements throughout history. Remember that April is all about civil rights. We've kind of covered stuff up to the 70s, and now we're kind of going to double back, and we're going to look at where do civil rights movements and moments and really important people, where do they fit in? What's happening in the the 1900s, basically. So today we're going to focus on segregation, and specifically how schools become desegregated thanks to two really important Supreme Court cases. We see Plessy v. Ferguson, I got my mouse moving, Plessy v. Ferguson, and Brown v. Board of Education. You should have your lecture notes. There's a Google Doc. I'm just going to look at mine on my phone, so if you see me looking down, it's usually the notes, or it's my cat. It's one of those two. So let's just go ahead and jump in. Our goal today is to be able to explain the significance of Brown v. Board of Education. You're going to have a reading that goes along with this, but we can't just jump straight into this Supreme Court case. We have to take a few steps back and kind of get some context, see how we get to this point. So, as you may recall, the 14th Amendment passed shortly after the Civil War, grants African Americans citizenship and guarantees them full and equal protection of the law, right? So 1868, 14th Amendment, everything should be good, and yet, no, it's not even close. Because why? Well, we have the civil rights cases of 1883. So here the Supreme Court declares, kind of clarifies that the 14th Amendment is only going to protect citizens from government infringement of civil rights, not private citizens or businesses. So here the Supreme Court, pretty early on, is declaring that that citizens are only protected from government infringement, but if you're a business owner, a restaurant, a movie theater, you can still deprive African Americans and really kind of any minority from their civil rights, right? So that's kind of setting the stage early on in 1883. So let's jump forward a little bit then to the case here in question, Plessy v. Ferguson, where we see separate but equal starting to come together as a concept. So let me move my little guy here. There we go. So in 1890, Louisiana had passed this thing called the Separate Car Act. It required that passengers on trains be seated separately by race, specifically in separate cars. So obviously, if you are African American, you are against this. Ironically, the railroad companies themselves were also against this law because they didn't want to have to spend extra money buying extra railroad cars, like to have a white railroad car, to have an African American railroad car, right? So Louisiana passes this law, and then comes Homer Plessy. So Homer Plessy is 1/8 black. He's 7/8 white. He's from Louisiana as well. And even though he is 7/8 white, under Louisiana law, he is still technically black, right? So, according to the Separate Car Act, Homer Plessy should be sitting in the African American car. So Homer Plessy is contacted by the Citizens Committee from New Orleans, and they're like, Homer, we want to test this law because we feel like this Separate Car Act is unconstitutional, right? So Homer's like, okay, let's test it. Homer Plessy, he buys a ticket for the train car. He gets on, he sits in the white section. He's questioned about his race by the railroad company. He refuses to move to the car he's supposed to be at, right, under law. He's arrested and then sent to jail. And then he's bailed out for $500. Remember, this is all being done on purpose, right? They're trying to create a situation to where they can sue the state. So Homer, he's arrested under this law. What is then his argument? So Homer Plessy, his argument, working with, let me just go back really quick, working with that Citizens Committee from New Orleans, right? They're supporting him. His argument is that, one, under the 13th Amendment, by segregating African Americans, you're essentially kind of like relabeling them under slavery, right? So like if you're going to treat them like a second-class citizen, then that seems like a violation of the 13th Amendment, right? So that's one part of his argument. The second part of his argument is that, and more importantly, under the 14th Amendment, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So he's saying here, that Separate Car Act is treating African Americans differently under the law. It's saying that there's one law if you're white, that there's a different law if you're African American, right? So these are Plessy's two arguments as to why the Separate Car Act is unconstitutional. So what does the Supreme Court decide, right? So they hear his arguments, and they say, first off, the 13th Amendment does not apply here, right? The 13th Amendment, according to the Supreme Court here, they say that the 13th Amendment only eliminates slavery, and that you're not a slave, therefore, we don't even need to worry about the 13th Amendment, that it doesn't matter here. As to the 14th Amendment, they say the state is not depriving you of equal rights. You want to ride a train? You want to ride a train car? The state is allowing you to do that. Now, is the state allowing you to ride with white passengers? No, but that's not what the 14th Amendment says, right? So long as you have access to those facilities, even if they're separate, as long as you have access to the same facilities, then that's not a violation of the 14th Amendment, so long as they're equal. And this is where we get that phrase, separate but equal. This is kind of a legal doctrine that lasts for about 50 years, right? So, Supreme Court, they decide here, separate but equal, perfectly fine, perfectly constitutional. Let me go forward. There we go. So, the Supreme Court justice here, he even says here, the object or the goal of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law. But in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based on color or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality. So right there, what is it saying? Yes, it's saying that white and black are equal, but it's not trying to say that they are one and the same, right? So the Supreme Court justice looked at it and said, well, hold on. White is white, black is black, and we still should treat them separately, right? And so there, he describes right there the position that separate but equal, whites can have their facilities, African Americans and pretty much every other minority, they can have separate facilities as well. So Plessy v. Ferguson ends up being applied to other cases later on throughout history. So there's a case also, this isn't in your notes, but it's good to know. There's a case called Lum v. Rice, where they looked at what happened in Plessy v. Ferguson when a Chinese American girl tried to attend a high school. So they looked at that and they were like, no, we are allowed to just flatly say no solely based on her race. We don't even have to give a reason. We can just say, no, she's not white, therefore she can't come to this specific white-only high school. So Plessy v. Ferguson actually ends up not just applying to African Americans, but all minorities for about 50 years. And so we begin to see separate but equal. This is the status quo all the way up to the case Brown v. Board of Education. But up to that point, segregation in the South, pretty much required. So we see here in this map, many of the northern states, primarily, segregation is either forbidden or it's optional, or there's just like no legislation around it. But specifically in the South, remember after Reconstruction, the South was like, we're just still going to have slavery, but we're just going to call it a different name and use the black codes and Jim Crow laws to kind of recreate it. In the South, all those red states, they're saying that segregation is by law required. So let's jump into Brown v. Board of Education. How does this change? How does the federal government change this? So going back a little bit, we see the NAACP, huh? Hopefully that sounds familiar. We're thinking W.E.B. Du Bois, huh? Right? That's why we talked about them, because we're going to talk about the NAACP. So the NAACP, they decide to challenge this long-standing Supreme Court case, this long-standing Supreme Court rule. And so there's 5 different cases, 5 different people all trying to enroll in white high schools. And so the Supreme Court, they take these 5 cases and they wrap them under one name, under one plaintiff, one person making the complaint, Oliver Brown, who was the father of Linda Brown, the student, right? Because Linda Brown was technically, she's a minor, so she can't be named in the case, so they name her father, Oliver. So Brown versus the Board of Education, right? And so they have the backing of not only the NAACP, but a attorney by the name of Thurgood Marshall, and he's going to go on to actually become one of the members of the Supreme Court, right? So here he's an attorney, he's with the NAACP, and they are working with the Brown family to overturn that decision from Plessy v. Ferguson. So, Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court, they step in here and they reverse flat out the ruling there in Plessy v. Ferguson. They reverse that idea of separate but equal. And you're going to kind of read why they do that. We're going to get into the reasoning there. But the effect here is that it desegregates schools. It said that separate is not and can never be equal, right? That solely just by creating a separate facility, a separate car, a separate water fountain, a separate library, that if you create a separate one, if you create a second one, that people, society will never see them as equal. And so the Brown v. Board of Education decision, it's really significant not only for the desegregating effect that it has, but also because they're using social science. They're using sociological, kind of like psychological evidence as well to show that if someone is presented with 2 options, with 2 different things, that they'll never be seen as equal. That even if you had the exact same, right down to the nail, right down to the floorboards, 2 facilities, that one is always going to be seen as better, as superior. And that wasn't even the case. You can see here in the pictures, if you compare a white school to an African-American school, that the facilities were never even equal in the first place, right? So the Supreme Court here says that separate is not and can never be equal. And it said that those segregated public schools were violating, sure enough, the 14th Amendment. They were violating them. So the Supreme Court looked back and said, that decision in Plessy, that was wrong. That decision in Lum with the Chinese American girl, that was wrong, right? So we're seeing the Supreme Court now support the goals of the civil rights movement. Let's go forward. There we go. So just a few years later, then, we see the Little Rock Nine. Who are the Little Rock Nine? Well, they are the first, let me move my little icon there. They're the first students to attend a desegregated high school in the Deep South. So it's 9 students who were registered, again, had the backing of the NAACP. They're registered to a white high school. And this central high school in Arkansas was told, you have to desegregate. The Supreme Court has spoken in Brown v. Board of Education. The students, those 9 students, faced a lot of hate. Mobs and crowds and riots kind of gathered, all yelling at them, spitting at them, telling them that they do not belong in that school. The Arkansas governor, Governor Phobos, sends in the state National Guard even to keep them out, right? So the governor of Arkansas is just flat out saying, no, we are not going to listen to the federal government, that we're not going to listen to the Supreme Court. So Eisenhower, so is the president before John F. Kennedy, Eisenhower then sends the Federal Army, the 101st Airborne, and forces the school to let them in, right? So you can imagine that standoff there. I have the same slide, but with a different picture here. So you can imagine that standoff, right? So like the state National Guard is there and they're like, no, these 9 students, right? 9 students who like just want to go to school. These 9 students, they're being blocked off by the state National Guard. And then the army now is in this like standoff / is also like, step out of the way, National Guard. These students are trying to go to school. And they're like, they guide them in, right? So you can see there in that picture, the 101st Airborne escorting these students into the school. So the Little Rock Nine, these are the first students to attend a desegregated high school in the Deep South. There we see some images of the crowds, of the outright anger and the fury there at these students just trying to attend, an equal school. And there, if you go to Arkansas, if you go to Little Rock, outside the Capitol, they have a statue there kind of commemorating that moment in history, right? And so then, those are the first students to attend a desegregated high school. We also have the first African American to attend a desegregated elementary school in the South, and that's Ruby Bridges. So Ruby Bridges, she was required to attend an African American elementary school in 1960, right? 1960. The Supreme Court already decided this, like years ago. And still the South is like not trying to allow desegregation. But Ruby Bridges, she was required to walk 6 blocks, walk through like this really rough neighborhood across the railroad tracks just to catch a bus to go to her school, when meanwhile, just 7 blocks away was a white school itself. And so that's the school she was trying to attend. And there, again, we saw the U.S. Marshals, the federal government, having to step in and force the states to allow these students to attend those schools. And here on the right, we see Ruby Bridges. And then who is this woman? Well, when Ruby Bridges went to the elementary school, on the first day, she and her mother spent the whole day in the office simply because it had caused such a riot. It caused such an uproar. The second day Ruby Bridges was there, all of the teachers walked out of the school. They refused to teach except for one teacher. That's the teacher there who stayed and taught Ruby Bridges literally in a room by herself. But she still pretended like there was a room full of students. And so there you see, they remain lifelong friends, kind of also making history together. So there we see the progression of desegregation, not only with schools being desegregated, but that decision in Brown v. Board of Education that says that separate can never be equal, that begins to become expanded not only to schools, but all other facilities as well, right? That logic applies then that you can't have separate sections of a bus, separate sections in a restaurant, separate water fountains, right? Like having 2 separate things, that's always going to create an imbalance. It's always going to create an inequality. So take a look at the document that I have for you there for the decision with Brown v. Board of Education. You already know the outcome, so what I want you to focus on is what is the reasoning there? How does the Supreme Court kind of undo what the past court said in Plessy v. Ferguson, and how do they unravel the logic of why separate but equal is unconstitutional? All right, nice work. See you next class. Keep on going.